Well, hello out there, podcast listening family. Welcome back to another episode of the Ricecast. We are so excited to be here with you today. We are in Clearwater, Florida, here at Calvary Church. My name is Anthony Russo. I am sitting across the table from the one, the only, Dr. Pastor Willie Rice. Pastor, how are you today?
Doing great. Good to be with you. It's great to be in the month of June and moving ahead in the summer, and so doing great.
We're here. We're in the summer now. Official start of summer, Memorial Day weekend.
To me, it is. Yeah, that's when it all begins. There's some date in June, June 21st, I think, when the technical people say the summer. But by then, it's 98 degrees outside, and we've had summer for a good while by then.
I was just
maybe in Maine, that's the beginning of summer.
Sure,
but in Tampa, no. We started about 6 weeks ago.
We get excited. We start early. You said something about Memorial Day being the kickoff. I got up to let the dog out today, and I got hit by that morning hot humidity. Sort of sucks the moisture right out of you when you walk out.
It's coming.
You go, oh, here it is. Summer's here.
Summer's here. We love it, though.
It's great. It's great. We're doing it. We had a really fun weekend at Calvary this last weekend, which is an interesting thing because, like you say, it's the kickoff of summer. A lot of people have a 3-day vacation. So oftentimes, here's a little behind the curtain maybe for you, Memorial Day weekend at a church can be a little bit light because
they let the youth pastor preach.
Yes,
they let it's like and they let we love our youth pastor, but it's that kind of weekend. It's like but for us it was a great kickoff to the summer because of the comeback schedule,
right?
And it was just an exciting week to get. We still have 3 services, so it's not like we're all in one service,
right?
We have 3 campuses, we had 3 services,
yeah,
But at each campus to have everybody in one service was very exciting, and it was what we hoped it would be, an opportunity for people to connect again and kind of see their church family again. And in some ways, it hasn't been that way since before COVID. And so it really was an exciting weekend, and I think a great kickoff for the summer. It's a temporary summer schedule.
Yeah,
we think we'll go back to 2 services in the fall, but we think it'll be a very exciting all summer long.
So here at the Clearwater campus, I'm the director of online ministry. I think we've talked about this before, and so I host online. If you're streaming with us online, I'm chatting with a lot of you during the service. My office that I host from is sort of next to the worship center area. The singing in the worship center area was so loud; it was pouring in through my office.
That's great, yeah.
So it was just a special.
And you have a palatial office. I mean, it's very large.
It's so
big.
The
singing gets into there.
It's so big. You could fit multiple brooms into my office. It's mad. No, it's a lovely spot. But it really, it was incredible. Just an energy that was really, really special. I was even curious. Now I know obviously we went through the pandemic, and so some of our stuff was online during that time. But when was the last time you were pastoring a church where you got up and taught one time? On a Sunday morning.
Doesn't happen much. I mean, there were a couple of years here at the Clearwater campus, and then you're going back a ways, probably 7-8 years or so, when we would do one service like on July 4th weekend in the middle of the summer, or we would do maybe one service right after Christmas, something like that. And it would be packed, but we would think we can get them in one service, and we did that. But it's been a couple of years because we reached a point where we thought, even on July 4th weekend, we just can't do that, and so we didn't do it, and we haven't done it in a number of years. So it really is kind of neat and unusual to be together.
Yeah, and I mean, you can tell already, like you said, in the fall, we're going to have to go back. You could just feel it in the room. But I only bring that up to encourage you, man, if you're able to get to a campus during these next 10 weeks, it's a special thing that you're going to want to be a part of.
Yep, it just is. And again, we did it a couple of years just on July 4th. We thought, well, let's get everybody together. And it was a kind of a patriotic, celebration. Yeah. And it was always a boost in the middle of the summer to and then we just got to where we couldn't even do it, even if you knew it was going to be a holiday weekend, you still couldn't do it. So but it creates an energy when it's more packed than normal. And it's very unusual for me. I have to preach only once. I feel like I haven't really, done what I'm supposed to do. So I have to just go out and talk to someone else, But it is going to be fun this summer, and just to worship together. That's what we wanted this summer. Let's come back, and it's really an interim step to get us ready for the fall, when there's going to be a renewed emphasis on our groups and our generational ministries. And so we're doing some of those things in the summer, but not as big as we're going to be doing in the fall. So this is kind of like a half step, and then by this fall, we really feel like, hey, it's a step forward, and that's exciting.
We are doing some of that during the summer, like you said, and I'll even throw out this little plug. Our online Bible study group starts not this coming Sunday, but the following.
Fantastic.
June 13th. June 13th. If you would like to join our online Bible study, it's going to be at 11:15. So it starts June 13th.
So hang in there, go to a Bible study. And, one of the things when we started coming back is it was just hard in some of those groups to do both well.
Right.
It's like you can do a group for in the room pretty well. When you're talking to everybody in the room, you see one another. Or you can do an online group really well.
Right.
But if you're trying to do both, it's really hard. And so what we're excited about in the future, because we know the online audience is still huge, and we want to create all those connection points. So we don't want our online audience to feel like, I got to be the second class guy in a group that's on campus, and then they stick you in a computer under a sofa or something, and you can barely see someone's shoe. So we think the online groups are going to grow and be great in the future, that there will be multiple online opportunities. But I'm excited to hear about that Bible study starting here very, very soon. And we think it'll be a better experience for the online people
100%.
Because you're connecting online. It's all geared to the online, and you need to get connected too. So that's also very exciting.
It's very exciting. I can't wait for that to kick off. I get to be a part of leading that. And yes, I think we all have experienced. We've all been part of a Zoom call where there's some in the room and it's no good. I mean, you're online. I can't hear what anybody's saying.
Right. You got to do one or the other.
Some joke happens. Everyone laughs. I don't know. What are they saying? It's no good.
So, and so many of our groups, some of our groups, I should say, are coming back this summer. And if you're still wanting to be online, you might consider shifting to an online group, because it probably will be a better experience for you than trying to peer into a bunch of people in a room.
Right. Yeah, it was an exciting weekend this weekend. It's going to continue on during the summer. This is at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. at all of our campuses.
We had a few
online.
show up late, just a couple. As hard as you do try to get the information out, and, there were some others who were coming in at 11. Again, help us get the word out, 10 o'clock.
10 a.m.
It'll be a great Sunday. I'm looking forward to this message and what this weekend is going to be about.
Yeah, we'd love to have you join us, like we said, on any of our campuses or online. We got to say before we keep going, because we got to give the people what they want, your Tampa Bay Lightning. 2 games up in the second round here of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Big win last night, and we're all pulling for the Bolts. I heard from some of you emailed me, some of you Canadians. I called out some Canadians last time and said you weren't jumping on board. I got some emails, Pastor.
They were jumping on board.
And I think some of it had to do with the Maple Leafs getting knocked out.
Okay.
But other bits, they're just...
We can be your second favorite.
Well,
we can be your second
happily take you.
Yes.
You are welcome on this bandwagon. There's always room. So come on. Pull for the Bolts. Be the distant Thunder. I'm trying to throttle back some, because you want to save some for when they go further into the playoffs.
Right.
I'm just lightly touching on it now. I haven't done a pre-service in a Lightning jersey.
Like a good sermon. You're building it up.
You got to build. You got to build it. Speaking of good sermons, Pastor.
Thank you. That's a nice little segue.
This last Sunday, we started the comeback series, kind of officially. We did some comeback-y stories kind of leading up to, but we really kicked off this last Sunday with the story of Hezekiah. You got that right? Hezekiah, the Old Testament names. You sometimes you're hesitant. Hezekiah is a great message. I'll put it in the podcast description if you missed it. But we talked about what was really a revival among the Jewish people under Hezekiah. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a word that's certainly more in the later years, more modern word revival. But It is,
right.
But certainly that's exactly what it was. It was an awakening. It was a spiritual restoration when Hezekiah, who was 25 years old when he became the king, and immediately set about kind of turning the nation back to God. And you see that, and that's what we looked at. It really is a great story. We only got to dive into a bit of it.
Right.
But really, if you read 2 Chronicles 29, 30, and 31, you can kind of read, lots of stories that relate to that period of Hezekiah's leadership.
Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about that revival word a little bit. Again, like you say, it's not the Old Testament, telling of the story doesn't call it a revival. It's a word that came later. And it's a word that, as you said it, and I think you even led off in the message something old folks would call a revival. This is what we want to see in our community, we want to see in our church, we want to see in our personal lives. But I think that word revival is an interesting one because you do, in the evangelical life, the church that we live in, it brings a twinkle to certain people's lives, or eyes, say. It makes them think of certain things. And the question I wanted to kind of center around our podcast today, being I'm 32, again, for people that might not know. For me, the idea, I don't know really what to make of it. I don't know that I've lived through a revival. And so, again, I'm just going to pose the question, and it honestly makes me feel a little uncomfortable to pose the question. But the question that came to mind when I was thinking about doing this podcast and that message Sunday was, is it even reasonable to think we might have a revival again? Because, like you said, there's an age that is like, I want to see this revival. I want to see this revival. And then I feel like when I hear those people say, I'm like, I just don't. Can we ask for this again? It can feel in some ways to me like, I want a milkman to come back, did we get?
You want to go to
it?
Mayberry or something?
Yeah. Is it an old thing that can't happen again?
No, I don't think that's true. I certainly think it can, and I think we should yearn for it. But I think it's a great conversation because in my generation, you grew up going to revivals every year. That's where I first heard the word, which was. Even in our churches here in Florida. Now, if you go to Alabama, in more rural situations, and I pastored in Alabama, which is where I refer to Alabama. There's certainly urban areas in Alabama. But you go to kind of the rural South, revival was almost like part of the seasonal calendar. In fact, many churches had 2 revivals a year. You could set your clock by them. It was like there's Easter, there's 4th of July, there's Thanksgiving, and there's the spring revival and the summer revival. And they would put them on the calendar. Well, I grew up going to churches where a revival was a periodic emphasis where you would announce that the church was having services every night. And I would grow up, it would be Sunday through, sometimes it was Sunday through Sunday, sometimes it was Sunday through Friday, then it got to be Sunday through Wednesday. It's kind of... then it got to be a one-day revival as it gradually began to dissipate. I got saved in a revival on a Saturday night. I was 9 years old. It was a Saturday night revival. And what you would do is usually bring in an outside preacher, an evangelist. And for many years, there were a number of pastors. That's how they made their living. They were traveling evangelists whose ministry was revivals, basically. And I don't even know the name of the man. He isn't a famous evangelist as far as I know, but he came to the East Chelsea Baptist Church in Tampa, Florida, where my grandparents were members. And it was a Saturday night that I remember just feeling moved of God, and I went down and prayed to receive Christ. And so revivals were something that happened periodically, and I became a pastor. It was just, I kind of expected, I pastored a church in Dora, Alabama, so we would have revivals. And in fact, for 2 years before that, I traveled every summer in college preaching what they called student revivals, which meant we would roll into a town in Alabama, because it was in Alabama that I did it. We'd roll into town in Alabama, and from Sunday night to Wednesday night, I would preach a revival somewhere. And then I would travel on Thursday and preach Thursday night to Sunday morning, and travel Sunday afternoon, Sunday night to Wednesday night, and we did this all summer long.
Right.
Two of the greatest summers of my life. And they were revivals. You'd be rolling in to preach. They're bringing in a student team, they would say. a young preacher, to do a revival, and these would be little churches, and but we had a great time. So a revival became this thing on a church's calendar where you had special services. One of the quips was, a pastor one time who asked he had a children's message, and he asked the little boys and girls. Now they were having a revival starting the next week or so. Yeah. And so he said, now, does anyone know what a revival is, children? And a little boy said, yeah, revival is when we bring in a really good preacher. and it wasn't quite what the pastor wanted to hear. So, but it was sort of that like, we're going to, something different, So we had revivals. And that's what I grew up thinking a revival was. Now, it was still an important time, and on occasion, you would have God really move in those. Mm-hmm. You would see people saved. It was a time that the church really became catalyzed. Let's go invite everybody to church we've been inviting and they haven't come. Mm-hmm. Let's go make sure we've shared with our neighbors. And I would do revivals as a pastor. We would spend the days literally going to visit people, talk to people, you wanted to see many people saved. We'd pray, God, save people this week. We were eager to see people come forward and confess Christ. And that's kind of why you did a revival, to see people saved. And you also hope that it would just kind of stir up the church.
Yeah.
As I said Sunday, and this was a line I got from somewhere, I forget where, but a revival is a time when sleepy Christians get awake, nominal Christians get converted, and hard-hearted people get broken, and really come to the Lord. That's what you always were hoping would happen in a revival. And sometimes it did. But I have to confess that over time, it just became, one of those things that churches did. Mm-hmm. And it was only later that I began to realize, well, where did that come from? Like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And I think the distant memory in the evangelical memory, long memory, maybe one that, your generation doesn't even possess, is it harkens back to days in our country's history when that are sometimes referred to as the Great Awakenings. And if you study American history, you will study there were several times it's just hard to explain it. I think even secular sociologists study it and they can't really explain it. That over a period of years, an unusual religious fervor would fall upon people. And in a period of time, many people would be converted. And one of the reasons there's a Baptist church in every little town in the South or a Methodist church in every little town in the South is because when this revivalistic fervor swept across in the First Great Awakening, which was like 1730s, and then there was a Second Great Awakening even after the Revolution, and then, there have been several periods like that in American history. But it was during those Great Awakenings, particularly the Second Great Awakening and even beyond that, that Baptists and Methodists, maybe more than any group, just kind of caught that wave. That's why there are so many Baptist churches across the South.
Yeah.
It was born out of that revivalistic tradition. And I think because Baptists, and in those days Methodists, more than others, there were others, but more than others, Baptists and Methodists were really into that revivalistic tradition, and they had revivalistic preachers and pastors who would go to other places, and they would preach, and people would get converted, and they would start churches. So every little town has a First Baptist church and a First Methodist church and so forth. So that's where it comes from in our distant memory. Now, you get to 2021 and a waning of cultural Christianity in America, and a lot of people maybe in your generation are going, I don't even know what revival is.
Right.
You don't even have a memory maybe of going Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday night.
Right.
Thursday night, Friday night. I do. I still have that memory in my head of going to church every night for a week and it feeling exciting. Well, we quit doing that a long time ago. We quit doing it because a couple times we did it, nobody was coming.
Nobody came. That's
on Monday night we'd have revival.
Yeah,
and there's nobody was there, and it was like, ooh, this isn't much of a revival.
Right.
So at some point you just then it becomes a one-day revival,
right,
and so forth.
Which I remember some of those. Just to give context.
And we probably need some of that because it was a time that again it intensified a church's desire to see people saved and really look at your own spirituality. And go, am I right with the Lord? And we maybe are missing not having those times on the calendar.
Yeah. Let me ask you just your opinion. because this I do remember vividly. The Billy Graham Crusades.
Yep.
Would you say that was cut from the cloth of
Billy,
on a big
you know,
scale?
what Billy did, Dr. Graham, I feel strange calling him Billy.
Sorry, yeah.
Billy, like my neighbor Billy, like Billy Graham, the great Billy Graham. I mean, his was really focused on crusade, and that's what he even called them. We wouldn't probably even use that word today because it would have connotations.
Yeah.
But the crusade was this, out of that revivalistic culture, Billy Graham came into an age where evangelical churches were established, but he was trying to go after the lost, the unconverted, and he would gather these churches in various cities and organize these area-wide crusades. So it's in that revivalistic tradition, but his whole focus would be, certainly you want to see Christians get roused up and the fire get, fanned up again.
Yeah.
But the whole focus of Billy was converting people, seeing lost people occur. But again, he was ministering in a time when America had kind of a Christian memory, so that people understood. That's why when he said the Bible said, everybody stepped up. It was like he made the Bible clear to them. We are living in a day in which people don't even believe the Bible's true necessarily. Or you can say the Bible says, and they might go, well, that's interesting. Don't know if I agree with that or not.
Yeah, right.
So what does it look like today? I think that's the big question. What
Yep.
should we be yearning for today? I think, let's say what we shouldn't be yearning for. When you kind of touched on it, it's just a return to the past. Let's revive that. Let's go back to Mayberry. You know what that is? I don't know if you know. That's Andy Griffith's show. Let's go back to Mayberry.
Okay.
And when it was this small town, the sheriff didn't carry a gun.
Oh,
and everybody unlocked their doors.
Everyone.
Yeah. The worst thing that happened was people argued over a flavor of ice cream or something. And
sure.
you have this idealized view of the 50s in America.
Right.
And it may have been, it was one of the greatest television shows ever produced. But it has an idealized view of America, small town. But let's be honest, wasn't racially diverse.
Nope. Right.
You didn't tell that story. You just idealized the past, though.
Yep.
Everybody seemed to get along. Sheriff didn't need a gun. Everybody unlocked their doors. And there are people, maybe my parents' age, who remember some of those times, and say, "Yeah, I remember what it was like." And you forget some of the bad stuff, like you forget the racism or the segregation or what other people were going through. You remember the good things.
Yep.
And but revival isn't going back to the past. Look, thank God for the blessings of the past and the memories that we have. You're not going back to 1950. There isn't a time machine that's going to take you back to that. We really want our sheriff in Clearwater to carry a gun. I mean, sad to say, but it probably is a needful thing. We are just in the world in which we are and so simply to pine for a return to old days is not productive. And here's what churches do. Most churches would acknowledge they're not pining for the 1950s, but they really kind of are.
Right.
They remember the day when, I remember the choir was like this, or I remember the music was like that, or I remember when we went to Sunday school like that. And they remember this time, and they have this idealized vision of it, and a romanticized version of it. And so revival is like, can we go back? And I have been to churches that lived in the past. You saw it by the pictures on the walls. You saw it by what they talked about the most. They had the old pastor's pictures on a hallway. They had pictures of what happened back in 1967 but there were no stories about what's happening now. And if you asked them, well, what are you trying to do in the next 5 years? They couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
It was just like, I wish we could go back to that day. And it's a dying cycle in a church to just remember the past. So revival is not that. That's not revival. Jesus told a very important story about new wineskins and old wineskins.
Yeah.
And he said, in the new wine, he said, you don't take new wine and put it in old wineskins. And now, if you don't know what a wineskin is, that you might lose the metaphor. But in Jesus' day, everyone knew what it was. It's a leather-like purse, if you will, a pouch in which they stored the wine. Well, over time, they become dry and brittle. And new wine, which is still fermenting, perhaps, you don't pour it into the old wineskin. It's going to burst. It's going to leak. If the wine continues to expand, the brittle old wineskin isn't going to work.
Right.
What Jesus was saying is he was telling them their religious tradition in the first century in Judaism had kind of missed the mark. And if you think revival is just God filling up your old wineskin, you're missing the point. Revival is God doing a new thing, not an old thing. It's old in that it's bringing you back to your first love.
Right.
But it's new in that it's bringing you to a passion and a walk with Jesus that is a fresh encounter with God. So I fear that a lot of churches and a lot of Christians are missing the mark when we pray for revival and we're longing for a return to the past. What we need to be longing for is a return to God, which isn't going to take us back. It's going to take us forward. In fact, if revival really were to come, and let's define what we mean there, this a reviving, a renewal of our first love and of our fervor for the things of God. If that were to come in a way that seems supernatural, just all of a sudden something is happening.
Yeah.
It's not going to look like the past.
Right.
It's going to look like something new. So it's a return to God, but it is an embrace of something new. And I think some churches never get it because they only want God to take them back. And I could go on and on about this. We have churches that we are, one of our visions at X150 is to help revitalize some churches.
Yeah.
And so I'm not trying to, be very careful how these stories I tell because they're all real stories.
Yeah.
But we've talked to churches that are dying. They know they're dying. They're down to literally, 10, 20, 30 people sometimes. Can't pay the bills. They're dying. I can tell you of a church in our county runs less than 10 in an auditorium that seats over 600.
Wow.
They use a room off to the side.
Yeah.
We've tried to get them to use it for other things. I shouldn't say too much because
Yeah.
Well, there was a church we tried to deal with, and it was clear when you talked to them, though, that they weren't willing to do what it's going to take to see God move. All they really wanted was to go back to the way it was 30 years ago.
Right.
And they would tell you how many they ran back in the 1970s. And they really, and honestly, they would tell you this, they wanted the music back from the 1970s. They wanted the hymns back from the 1970s. They had this view of what their church was 40 years ago, and they wanted to go back to it. Now, I would agree with them that what their church was 40 years ago is immeasurably better than what it is today.
Right.
I mean, it was a vibrant, healthy church.
Sure, yeah.
But the key is not going back 40 years. The key is going to the Father. It's going. Billy Graham was once accused of, hey, you set the church back 200 years. And he said, well, my bad. He said, I hope to set it back 2,000 years. I was trying to get it back to the original.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like some people want to go back 40 years. No, you need to go back further than that.
Yeah.
You need to go back to the Lord. And when you do, God is going to do something new.
Right.
And fresh and different and better than it's ever done before. And if you're not willing to let God do that, then you really are not praying for revival.
And that's kind of the tension, isn't it? Is being a part of a tradition as long as ours is you hold these moments of greatness, and you touched on some of it just culturally, but even in our own tradition, moments of horrendous missing and getting it wildly wrong, but also moments where it was great and there was really positive things happening. You're holding those while looking ahead towards what the future might bring. I think that's a tension in almost every area of everything we do.
Yep.
Is you're like, well, what does this look like going forward?
Yep.
And also, how do we not lose what was so great about from where we've come? Because I think something that gets lost when certain people, and you've used a great line. You have a lot of great quips. I'll give you that. And one of like, I'm not shooting at you, but I'm shooting there, and if you're standing there, it may hit you. But there are people that, they just, when they hold on to a revival, they're just thinking back to these things and they are glamorizing them. But I'm glad you said something you said. What happened was, here's where the story gets twisted. We just stopped doing it versus, no, it stopped working. People stopped coming to it.
Revival just became another thing on the church calendar.
Yeah.
It wasn't really revival.
Right.
And, again, there was some good revival. I got saved in a revival.
Yeah, of course.
But it isn't going to be just going back and doing what we did 30 years ago. It's going to be, what does it mean today?
Right.
And honestly, we may be ripe for some mechanism where, hey, we need more prayer. We need more focus on evangelism. Mm-hmm. We need something that says, okay, hey, have you invited your neighbor to church lately? Okay, this is the excuse. Get out and tell them, but it may not look like the old wineskin. Mm-hmm. Quick story from the Hezekiah Revival, so I think it's pertinent, and it's one of my favorite passages to preach. I don't remember the last time I preached it, but there's a story when Hezekiah becomes the king. There's idolatry that has invaded the worship of the people of God. And one of those things was the bronze snake of Moses. We didn't touch on the story at all, but it is a great story. And I think you read it in 2 Kings, I think 19. I didn't look it up, so I'm probably wrong. Probably shouldn't have said it, but it's in 2 Kings.
Okay.
And I don't know that 2 Chronicles tells this story. So Hezekiah's revival is talked about in 2 Kings, but it's also talking about in 2 Chronicles. So it's the King's version that tells the story.
Right.
So there's this, it's called Nehushtan. It's this bronze serpent that was either in the temple or it was in the temple, I believe, connected with the worship of people. But they were burning incense to it. In other words, it was like another idol.
Yeah. Right.
So Hezekiah becomes the king, and he's like, what is this bronze snake people are praying to? How can the people pray? Well, you find her out. Well, Moses built it. And it comes from the story in Numbers where people are dying because of snake bites in Numbers, and the Bible says God had Moses build the image of a snake, put it on a pole, and tell people that if they looked at it, it was their way of looking to God and asking for forgiveness.
Right.
And it also, Jesus talks about it in John 3. If I be lifted up, I'll draw them into me. He quotes that story. So, but here's the forgotten part of that. So Moses uses this snake. It's an instrument for, redemption.
Yep.
And then what happens to it? Well, we don't know. Somebody put it in their garage, and then they carried it around, and they put it in a museum.
Yeah,
and then,
right.
So about 500 years pass. Hezekiah becomes the king. That's like 500 years, if my timeline is right. Hundreds of years at least.
Yeah.
Hezekiah becomes the king, and this snake has been brought out of somewhere. They took it out of the Smithsonian, and they put it in the temple, and they're praying to it. They're burning incense to it. And Hezekiah goes, what is this? This isn't what worship is about. He says, we're tearing down the snake. Now you can just imagine somebody going, whoa, 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 young man. Moses built that snake.
Right.
That's been around 500 years. Hezekiah goes, I don't care. I'm glad Moses used the snake and God had him build it, but God never intended for us to pray to it. God never intended for us to burn incense to it. It's now become an object of idolatry. What God used yesterday, now the devil's using. Because it was God's instrument, but then it just became a tool to remember, and now the devil's used it to become an idol. And I think things like that happen in churches. I think God shows up in certain areas and he uses things to point us to him. But then time passes, and we quit looking at him, and we start looking at the thing he used. And then more time passes, and all we're left with is this thing and a story. This is how God worked. But we're not looking to God. We've missed God.
Yeah.
And then a new Hezekiah rises up and goes, we need to tear that down.
Yeah.
And oftentimes an older generation will say, we can't change that.
Right.
You can't quit that. You can't take that away. Why, that was used by God 50 years ago.
Right.
Guess what? God's not using it now. In fact, you're missing God. We need to get back to what God told us to do. So Hezekiah, get to the end of the story, tore down the snake. And that was part of what revival took place.
Right.
And I just think there's a lot of good old bad snakes.
Yeah.
That was the title of an old message I preached. Good old bad snakes. It was good, it was old, and it was bad all at the same time. So good old bad snakes. There are a lot of good old bad snakes in our lives and in our churches that the devil uses to make us actually miss God. And we got to tear them down. So that's all to this point of revival isn't pining for some idealized past a few decades ago.
Right.
Revival is hungering for God.
Right.
It's hungering for God.
So my question then becomes, and it may be difficult to answer or really pin anything to, but even something you brought up early in this conversation, you have these hearkenings back to things like the Great Awakening and these, while the mechanisms that were used during those things, a preacher getting up in front of large, that's great. A lot of it's still replicated today. So those things are fine. But what really happened was supernatural. Everybody would say it was not any.
God did something.
Billy Sunday is not like a magical recipe that.
Right.
No, it was God did something, and it transitions into, because this is what happens, and it happens all the time. It transitions into, well, how do we get it on the calendar? Mm-hmm. Well, we'd love for that to happen again. Let's put it on there twice a year. Because we want to see our community, and these come from good places. Right. I hate when this is always characterized as like somehow there's a bad intention here. No,
traditions are traditions for a good reason usually.
Right. So how do we how do we really pine for? How do we truly and authentically and in the most productive way try to bring about revival? Yeah. Which I know is a big question.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know that there's a simple answer. And books have been written on revival. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a great field of study. But I think it is just kind of what we've already touched on. It's not settling for the religiosity. It's not settling for a ritual. It's not settling for an experience. It's not settling for anything other than God. Mm. And then being willing for God to move in our life in whatever that looks like. Mm. I just honestly think most churches couldn't stand a genuine revival because it would spook them.
Yeah.
It wouldn't look like that what they think it's going to look like. And because we're not willing to say, okay, God, just move in our lives, move among the lost. Look, we know some things it's going to look like. The Word of God is going to be exalted. Mm-hmm. There's going to be confession and repentance and a drawing to God. But are we willing to let God take over our agenda and move in our lives? I can almost tell you, revival, if it comes, like this move of God, it's going to look different than you can imagine. Mm. And but should we pray for God to move in ways that yes, of course we should, in ways that rouse the church from its slumber. We do need to pray for that. So when I hear people, in the best sense of the word, praying for revival, what I hear them praying for is, God, wake us up.
Yeah.
We've become carnal. We've lost our first love. We've become lukewarm. Wake us up.
Yeah.
Let sin be confessed. Let first love be what captivates us again. Wake us up. And we're praying. And God, do something to break the hearts of lost people, that just where in ways that are beyond anything we can really understand, you're moving and drawing people to yourself. And that doesn't mean we don't have work to do and we just wait for God to do something. But we should hunger for God to do more than we can do. So I think we should be praying for revival. I think those that disparage that are wrong. We should be praying, God, move in a way in our country, in our community, in our city. Can you imagine if all of a sudden all the churches were full and people were all of a sudden getting saved in the most random, extraordinary ways and becoming like they're under conviction already, and they're like, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? And we should pray for that. And in the meantime, work day by day and week by week to do the work of ministry, do the work of church, and be joyful with what God does give us. But let's also hunger for God to do more.
Yeah. No, it's good. And it makes me think, too, even when you talk about that snake, when you talk about the next and what's the new way that God's moving, God had not used a bronze snake prior to that, that story. God's not used a bronze snake since that story. So that was a new thing. And if I remember that story correctly, there were Israelite people that even said, I'm not going to look at this. I'm dying of a snake bite. That's not going to help me.
Right.
It's to maintain the eyes on where
we
God is.
We often get enamored by the things God uses, and we instead of looking at God, which is why God maybe often uses new things. There's only one burning bush.
Right.
There's only one Nehushtan. These are all pictures that point to Christ. He's who we should be looking at. There's not a new solution there. It's Christ is the solution. But let's not fall in love with. Another way of saying this, let's not fall in love with how we do church. Let's fall in love with why we do church, and let's fall in love with the one whom we worship at church. And the churches that fall in love with how they do church are the ones that, end up missing God over time.
And they've probably had a tough couple of years,
yes,
this last little run we've been on. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, pastors. It's been a great episode here, if I do say so. In my humble opinion, as a host of this podcast, this was a great episode of this podcast. So thank you so much for listening. We so appreciate everybody who reaches out Lets us know you're listening. Lets us know your thoughts. If there's any topic you want us to cover, anything in particular you'd like to hear us discuss, we'd love to hear that. Send it in. You can send it in through the Calvary Instagram. That's calvary.us. You can email me, arusso@calvary.us. Love to hear from you. And thank you to everybody who leaves a review, rates the podcast, shares it with your friends. It means so much. Love doing it and love hearing from you guys, the listeners. So we'll be back again here very soon with another episode.